A lot of times it's very hard to understand the reasons that God did what he did. Some events seems crazy to us in our generation. One of the most troubling events is the flood. Did God just commit a worldwide genocide? Another is the ritual of the tabernacle, where God ordered the killing of thousands of innocent animals, besides so many other atrocities that is documented in the Old Testament. One thing that I learned to appreciate about the Bible is that the Bible does not lie, does not hide facts. Like in the past, when a king would conquer another king's land, kingdom, whatever it was, they would destroy everything from the statues, from the chronicles, from the records, whatever they had of the previous king. The Bible is not like that. God kept the good, the bad, and the ugly. Even though sometimes it's hard for us to understand, we have to appreciate the fact of God's honesty and transparency. Our greatest challenge to understand this event is the completely different reality, the distance in time, location, and culture that makes it so hard for us to get it, but it's not completely impossible. With some context, as we study, we can understand. This is going to be a brief history study. I will not be able to cover every event, but at least the principles of what I understood to be the reason that God either acted this way or allowed for something to happen. I have seen that the short study covering a long period has helped a lot of people make sense of these events. As I studied the Bible with many people, people that were raised in church, Christians, other people that have not even heard of God, I noticed that having a timeline, a sequential timeline, helps them make sense of the Bible and the plan of redemption. So that's why I put this study together. So strap your boots, hold on to your seat, pause anytime you need, take lots of notes, because we will have about 2,000 years of history in just a few minutes. So let's start. Right after the fall, we covered that in our last study. The next major event was the first murder case registered in scriptures. Two brothers, most likely not the only ones living at the time, but the Bible can't mention every single person and event, or the Bible would be with infinite number of pages. But it seems that God chose the stories to be covered in the Bible according to what would help us understand the plan of redemption. God gives a specific instruction of how the sacrifice was supposed to be made. This sacrifice was to represent Christ that one day would die for us as an innocent lamb of God, who would shed the blood in our place. Cain decides that he was not a shepherd as his brother, so he decided to bring the best of his produce to put in the altar of sacrifice. Great idea, but not what God told him to do. What is interesting is that God does not get mad at Cain, but Cain gets upset because God did not accept his offering. If you're not familiar with this passage, stop here and go read Genesis chapter 4. God notices Cain's attitude and warns him to be careful, to basically control his temper or sin would dominate him. By the way, at this point, God did not visit them in person anymore. People could only hear God. Not because God wanted to distance himself from humanity, but because God's presence would destroy humans. For our protection, he had to distance himself from us after sin entered the world. Instead of listening to God, who was just trying to show him mercy and help him, Cain goes and kills his brother. How crazy is this? How our choice can affect not only our lives, but generations to come. Then we see this conversation between Cain and God, where God is trying to make Cain understand what he did. Cain shows no remorse, at least not that is recorded in the Bible. God tells him what would be the consequence. Cain has the audacity to still complain. And with one last act of mercy, God still puts a mark on Cain to protect him. When I tell this story, everybody asks me, what was Cain's mark? Nobody knows. And if somebody tells you that they know, they're lying. They're making that up, because the Bible does not reveal. Everything else, it's people interpretation, and that's very dangerous. This is something that in heaven we may find out, but right now we don't know what it is. This story, if you read slowly and carefully, you can see God's patience, protection, and mercy. From that event, we start to see a division of the people of God. Cain is sent to live away from his people, probably because he did not show repentance and his attitude would affect others. Many people ask me, where did the wife of Cain came from? Who are these other people that Cain even built the first city? There are many theories the Bible does not explain. Most likely all children of Adam and Eve. By the time that Cain killed Abel, there were many other children, and they lived literally hundreds of years and had many, many children. At this point, Adam's lineage is through his next son, Seth. When we get to Noah's time, evil had taken over the minds of pretty much the entire population of Earth. This is registered in the book of Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Many look at this event as a vengeful God that decided to exterminate the entire planet because his creature decided to disobey him. I have a little different take on this, and it's because of this passage. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. In my view, if God did not interfere with the way the civilization was going, we would have become extinct. Instead of looking at as an evil God that sent the flood to destroy people, I see as a God of love that sent the ark to save those that there was still a little bit of hope that they could have a little good in them to give continuation to humanity. Because Noah and his family were definitely not perfect. There are plenty of not very good things that happened right after the flood. After the flood, God's trying again. He promised to never exterminate humanity with water as he did before. Humanity has a new fresh start. God decides to change his strategy. Few hundreds of years later, he calls another man called Abraham to start over. Now, God wanted to pretty much train a man who was going to be the father of a great nation. This nation was going to represent God to the world and bring the world to know the true God. In a very summarized version, that was the point of God calling Abraham and choosing Israel as the chosen nation. Not because they are or were more special than anyone else, but God gave them a responsibility to bring the rest of the world to know him. Much like the responsibility that us Christians have today. A great responsibility, but a privilege. Abraham marries Sarah. They can't have a child. Sarah has a brilliant idea to give her maid to have a child with her husband. Abraham does not even question. Weird. Abraham has a child with Hagar, Ishmael. Later, God makes it clear that no, that is not the child of the promise, but maybe because Abraham and Sarah is slow to comprehend, God this time is very clear. The baby will be yours, Abraham, and Sarah's. Long story, they do end up having Isaac. You can find this story in Genesis chapters 11 through 22. Isaac marries Rebekah. They have twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Father likes Esau, mother likes Jacob. Rebekah sees that Jacob is more spiritual and should be the one to inherit the position as a leader of their family. She decides to help God a little, much like her mother-in-law did. And along with Jacob, they trick her husband to give Jacob the blessing that should be to Esau. When Esau finds out, he's furious. Jacob has to run away, and he went to live with his uncle Laban. But immediately, when he gets there, he falls in love with Rachel, his cousin. That was normal back then. I am just sharing the story. Jacob had nothing to provide for his bride, so he makes an agreement with his uncle to work for 7 years in exchange to marrying Rachel at the end. After 7 years, on the wedding night, his nice uncle and the two sisters tricked Jacob, and he actually marries Leah, Rachel's older sister, and it becomes a mess. Laban, his uncle, ends up giving Rachel as well at the end of the wedding week, but he has to work another 7 years again for Rachel. Rachel can't have children, but Leah keeps having children, and that drives Rachel crazy. So she decides to follow the footsteps of her grandmother, Sarah, and give her husband her maid to have children for her. It seems like it was a thing back then. Then later, Leah stops having children and give her maid as well. So Jacob ends up having 12 sons, one daughter between Leah, Rachel, and the two maids. Rachel gets pregnant later. So Rachel seems to have been Jacob's true love. Many years later, when Jacob already had 10 sons and a daughter, Rachel gets pregnant. First son was Joseph, and the second was Benjamin. While she was giving birth to Benjamin, she dies. Jacob treats these two sons differently than the others, probably because they were Rachel's kids, and also because they were children of his old age. That causes jealousy to an actual dangerous level. That when Joseph is a teenager, the older brothers sell him as a slave, but only after trying to kill him first. Jacob's story is from about Genesis 26 all the way to about 35. Just read the entire Genesis and you will be fine. Joseph's story is beautiful. It starts in Genesis 37, a must read. He's first sold to Potiphar. He stays there for a few years. Potiphar's wife makes a move on Joseph. He refuses it. She accuses him of trying to rape her. He gets sent to jail. He was in jail for 7 years, but just like happened in the house of Potiphar, God blesses Joseph and everything he does, and soon he is managing jail. One day, two of the inmates have a dream. God gives the interpretation to Joseph. Later, when Pharaoh has a dream, Joseph is called to interpret it. God gives the interpretation to Joseph, and because of that, he becomes the second in command and saves Egypt and all of the surrounding nations from starvation. Later, Joseph's brothers come, they reunite with Joseph. Joseph forgives them. It's a beautiful story. I cry when I read it every time. His family moves to Egypt, and that is the beginning of what later is known as the 400 years of Israelite slavery in Egypt. But they did not start as slaves. When Joseph's family first came to Egypt, they were nobility, well respected for Joseph's position in court. It was after Joseph's death and the next Pharaoh that had no respect for Joseph or his God that later the Egyptians started to become concerned with the fact that the Israelites are growing too much, and they were afraid they would take over their nation, that they started to oppress them and later made them into slaves. Now I want you to imagine with me, the people of God, when they went into Egypt, they were only 70 people, the family of Joseph. They grew and multiplied in a period of 400 years to millions. 400 years is pretty much the age of the US. Imagine what was the US 400 years ago and what it is today. Their entire existence at this point was in Egypt, and the majority of the time they were slaves that had no choices, had to obey their masters, and were not allowed to worship the true God. They lived in a polytheist nation that worshipped everything from the river to the animals, even insects, it seems. By the time that Moses came into the picture, God used their own gods in the plague to show that God is the only true God, to start undermining their beliefs, at least to the Israelites, that after living among Egyptians for many generations had little idea of who they were or who their God was. For this reason, even after God sent the plagues that destroyed Egypt and opened the Red Sea right in front of their own eyes, they still did not trust God and were constantly challenging Moses and God. And that is the reason they had to spend 40 years walking around the desert. They were literally walking in circles. It did not take them 40 years to get from Egypt to the Promised Land. They reached the Promised Land within months. But they did not trust that God could take down the residents of the Promised Land. They were right there in the Promised Land. They sent 10 spies, including Joshua and Caleb, when the other 8 spies said that there were giants in the land, and they did not believe they were able to go against them. God realized that they were not ready. They needed to relearn what it was to be the people of God. And God spent the next 40 years teaching them with daily object lessons in the desert through the tabernacle. I skipped a lot of stories. and details of the stories, but I kept what was important to understand the plan of redemption. And the reason some of God's actions seems too crazy to us, but were necessary. Every single one of God's actions has always been for our protection and salvation. When we can't understand, just trust. One day we will get it. And this is the foundation for our next lesson that explains the tabernacle and how the entire plan of redemption is taught in the tabernacle. And that's what they were doing for 40 years. They were learning that lesson.